Imagine growing up every day being humiliated, isolated, and seen as invisible in the eyes of others. Now, imagine that this same person, marked by pain and rejection, not only overcame their past, but also became a respected leader, inspiring everyone around them. How did this happen? What drove this radical change? Prepare to experience a story of resilience and strength that will challenge everything you believe about leadership, redemption, and the power to transform your own life. Every scar Alex bore wasn't just a reflection of what had happened, but of what he'd been forced to endure over the years. They weren't visible scars, but deep wounds that mapped out his childhood. School for him was never a place of learning and fun, like it was for other children. It was a silent war, where he was the target, and the words, sharper than any sword, cut into his soul in ways no one could understand. And the worst part? He couldn't escape. There was nowhere to hide from himself and the Somme, voices that constantly haunted him. From the moment Alex entered school, the first glances and giggles began to form. The children, as if already with a target in mind, began to laugh at him for his simple clothes, his introverted manner, his slightly different ways. Each day at school became a battle against shame, humiliation, and the constant fear of what would come next. Instead of friends, he had enemies. Instead of support, he had isolation. The cruel words echoed in his mind like an endless echo. You're not good enough. You don't belong here. It wasn't just the verbal bullying that tormented him. The jokes about his body, his way of speaking, and even his skin tone made him feel smaller every day. It was as if he were a ghost, a person who existed but was unseen. Every shove, every laugh, every mean comment chipped away at his self-confidence. And worst of all, he believed every word. He began to see himself as others did, worthless, without dignity, without hope. But what no one knew was the real impact these words were having. They were much more than simple insults. They were seeds of insecurity, loneliness, and pain, which blossomed in his mind, like a dark field of doubts and fears. Bullying wasn't just something that happened at school, but something that followed him home, to moments of reflection in the silence of his solitude. When he was alone, he asked himself, will things ever change? Will people ever see that I am more than what they say about me? The pain of bullying wasn't just physical. It was emotional, psychological. Every averted glance, every forced smile from his peers, every chuckle behind his back were memories stored in the deepest drawers of his soul. But the greatest impact was the way he began to see himself. He no longer believed he could be someone different, someone important. In Alex's eyes, his fate seemed sealed. He would always be the outcast, the easy target, the one who would pass through life invisible, leaving no trace. And that was exactly where his true battle began, not against the bullies or the words others spoke, but against himself. Because when the words began to resonate, he internalized them. What others said about him became the truth he began to believe. He began to think he had no potential, that he was incapable, that his worth was less than that of others. The pain, which had previously seemed fleeting, became a part of who he was. He no longer knew where the bullying ended and his own identity began. But who could have imagined that, amidst so much suffering, amidst so much pain, an unexpected strength would emerge within Alex? Because, as you will see in the coming chapters of this story, this pain didn't destroy him, but transformed him. Not immediately, nor simply, but over time, he began to realize something that would change the course of his life. Every challenge he overcame, every pain he endured, was forging something greater within him. Alex's transformation wasn't something that happened overnight. It wasn't a magical turnaround or a miraculous event. But little by little he began to realize that the wounds others had inflicted on him no longer defined who he was. He was beginning to understand that, although bullying had been a part of his story, he didn't have to let it be all he was. He could change. And most importantly, He could use his pain to become someone stronger, someone who could inspire others. Now, imagine the impact such a profound change has on someone's life. From being seen as invisible to being recognized as a leader. From being that person who never had the courage to stand out to being someone who now leads and inspires. And yes, this is Alex's story. But who knows? It could be yours too. Because if you've ever experienced rejection, pain, or bullying, know that you're not alone. Transformation is possible, and it all starts with the decision to not let yourself be defined by what others say about you. If you identified with this story, if Alex's words resonated with you, I invite you to continue following this journey. Don't miss the next steps in this incredible transformation. And if you want to see more stories of overcoming, inspiration, and real change, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. This isn't just about what you're watching, but about how you can transform your life. Let's join us on this journey of redemption and leadership. Alex felt the weight of every look. They weren't looks of friendship, of welcome, but looks of judgment. Looks that stripped him bare, that mercilessly exposed his weaknesses. Every day at school seemed like a repeat of yesterday's humiliation. He didn't know how, but something inside him was breaking, as if every cruel word, every laugh behind his back was a brick being placed on top of him, building a wall of insecurities and doubts he couldn't break down. He looked at himself in the mirror, but didn't recognize the person in it. The mirror didn't just show a thin, shy body. It wasn't just his appearance that bothered him, but the distorted image he had of himself. The words he'd heard over the years had planted seeds of inadequacy that grew and took over his mind, until there was no room for positive thoughts. How could he feel good about himself when the only thing he heard were mockeries about the way he spoke, his appearance, his very existence? Alex's self-esteem was shattered. He spent hours wondering what was wrong with him. Why couldn't he fit in? Why did it feel like he never belonged, like a misplaced piece in life's puzzle? If he tried to express himself, whether in class or in conversation with his peers, insecurity paralyzed him. He lacked the confidence to assert himself, to be who he wanted to be. After all, the voices in his head constantly told him, "You're not good enough. You don't deserve to be here. You don't deserve to be happy." The teasing of others began to erode his confidence to the point where he began to isolate himself. And when he isolated himself, solitude somehow seemed more comfortable than trying to fight a world that made him feel small. But this solitude wasn't peace. It was a prison. And worst of all, he didn't know how to escape it. He began to believe that being invisible was his only option for survival. Being the shadow, the one who went unnoticed, was the only way to avoid further humiliation. As the years passed, Alex began to feel his identity dissolving, as if he were being erased by the words and actions of others. He no longer felt capable of being anyone other than that insecure, quiet, and harmless boy whom others mocked. Any attempt to change seemed futile, a struggle against a turbulent river that always pulled him back to the shore of doubt and shame. He wondered if he would ever have the courage to step out of this shadow, if he would ever have the strength to show the world that he was not what others said. Over time, even his own dreams began to feel distant, almost like a memory from another life. He could no longer believe he could be anything great. How could someone who had always been diminished achieve anything greater? How could he become a confident person if every time he tried to take a step forward, he felt the invisible chains of bullying pulling him back? The bullying wasn't just in the mockery. It was within Alex, in his reactions, in his choices. He was trapped in a cycle of self-criticism, shame, and insecurity, unsure of how to break the spiral. Every defeat he felt within himself seemed to fuel an even stronger sense of inadequacy. He wasn't good enough to be loved, respected, or seen. He was invisible, a shadow in the world. And somehow, he had already begun to believe it. Alex's confidence wasn't something that could be easily rebuilt. It wasn't just a matter of wanting to be different. It was something deeper, something that came from his daily experiences and the words he absorbed in his mind, often without realizing it. He began to see himself not as a person of value, but as someone simply passing through life without leaving an impact. Sometimes the cruelest words didn't come from others, but from himself. He sabotaged himself, anticipating failure before even trying. He didn't believe in himself, didn't trust his ability to do things differently, to be different. Bullying not only robbed him of his confidence, but also made him doubt his own identity. Who was he, really? This constant doubt gnawed at him. He knew he didn't want to live like this forever, but he had no idea how to change. He was sinking, unaware that the weight of his own insecurities was becoming as great as the bullying he'd endured over the years. It was a silent battle, a battle against himself. And until that moment, Alex didn't know how to fight the toughest enemy of all, the belief that he would never be good enough. If you've ever felt this way, as if the weight of the world were on your shoulders and cruel words were inside you, know that you're not alone. Alex's story is, in fact, the story of many of us. But the journey doesn't end here. True transformation is yet to come. And if you're ready to follow this journey of overcoming and self-discovery, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with those you know who need to hear it. You too could be the next person to transform. The pain had never been as intense as it was that day. Alex could still hear the sound of the phone ringing, a constant ringing that seemed to accelerate time, as if the world around him were in slow motion. It was one of those calls no one ever expects to receive, but when it does, it turns your life upside down. The news came without warning, without mercy. His brother, always so full of life, with the brightest dreams and the most infectious smile, had abruptly passed away. The accident, a fatality no one could have foreseen, had taken away someone Alex couldn't even imagine losing. The words sounded distant as he tried to process what was happening. "He's not coming back, Alex. There's nothing we can do." Each sentence seemed harder to understand than the last. The world, which already seemed a difficult place to navigate, now felt like an ocean of pain, where Alex was drowning, not knowing where to swim. The pain of losing his brother was visceral. It wasn't just the shock of emptiness he felt, but the weight of knowing that life often offers no respite. Everything he believed to be right, everything he took for granted, was now crumbling before him. But it was in that pain, in that empty space of anguish, that a small spark began to emerge. The emptiness was profound, and the loss was consuming him from within. But somehow, he knew his brother's life could not be lost in vain. He didn't know how, but in that moment of hopelessness, something inside Alex began to shift. That pain, so overwhelming, became a turning point, a fine line between being consumed by grief and finding the strength to carry on. Alex spent weeks unable to understand exactly what was happening to him. The loss of his brother left him darker, more withdrawn, but also more reflective. He began to look at his own life, at what it had been until then. A series of opaque days, of a boy who didn't believe in his own worth, who lived in the shadow of the cruel words of others. But then, the loss of someone so important and so close made him see, with painful clarity, how much he had let life pass him by. He had been consumed by so many insecurities, so afraid of being who he truly was, that he didn't even realize when he was letting time slip away. The silent tears that fell were a mixture of longing, pain, and regret. Regret for not having enjoyed more time with his brother, for not having been more present, for not having been stronger. But somehow, that pain taught him something unexpected. Life is too fragile to be lived in. Fear. He couldn't change what had happened, but perhaps he could change how he reacted to it. Perhaps, instead of losing himself further in the shadows of grief, he could find a new reason to live. He could be someone different, someone who would use pain as fuel to build something greater, to become stronger, more confident, and more aware of his own worth. That was the turning point. The pain of losing his brother didn't destroy him, but it awakened him to the reality of his own life. He realized he could no longer hide, living on the margins, waiting for life to simply happen without him taking control of his own destiny. What he lost could not be recovered, but the life he still had left was in his hands. And most importantly, he was no longer willing to live life as a victim, as someone who would always have to hide from hardship. Alex began to understand that the pain he was feeling now could be the very force that would drive him to change his life. He no longer needed to see himself as a broken person, a victim of a cruel past. He could see himself as someone who, despite everything, had the ability to rise again, to reinvent himself, to transform his pain into something positive. He had no control over the loss he experienced, but now he had control over his own journey. Every tear he shed became a drop of determination. He didn't want the pain to be in vain. He knew that by allowing himself to feel deeply, he was actually opening himself to what lay ahead. A new chapter. A chapter where he would no longer be a passive spectator of his own life, but the protagonist of its transformation. And so it was that, confronting the deepest pain of his life, Alex began to rebuild who he was. He knew the process wouldn't be easy, that the scars of loss would take time to heal, but he also knew that, instead of wallowing in emptiness, he could use this pain to rewrite his story. The pain of losing his brother would become the invisible force that would propel him forward, toward a new life, a life where he would no longer be an insecure, invisible boy, but someone with the power to overcome everything that had brought him down. And perhaps, deep down, Alex understood the greatest lesson of all. Loss is an inevitable part of life, but how we respond to it is what defines us. That night, Alex couldn't sleep. The pain of losing his brother still weighed heavily on his heart, but something had shifted within him. He woke in the middle of the night, the thought hammering at his mind, stronger than any sadness. The sound of others' laughter, the cruel words that had scarred him for so long, no longer resonated as powerfully as before. Perhaps for the first time in years, he was beginning to see life differently. He didn't know exactly what would happen next, but there was one thing he knew for sure. He no longer wanted to be a victim. He no longer wanted to live in the shadow of the past. This decision wasn't instantaneous. It didn't come from a moment of divine inspiration or a simple glimmer of hope. It was a gradual choice, forged in pain, loss, and loneliness. Alex was tired of seeing himself as worthless, always at the mercy of others, always hiding behind his own insecurities. He had spent so many years resigning himself to the idea that he was incapable, that he was worthless, that he would always be the invisible boy. But after the loss of his brother, something inside him broke, something inside him awakened. He remembered all the things his brother said about him. "You are stronger than you think, Alex. You have incredible potential. You just need to believe in yourself." Those words echoed in his mind, growing louder and louder. What his brother had told him, even without knowing it, now seemed like a truth he was ready to embrace. Alex no longer wanted to hide. He no longer wanted to live as a passive spectator of his own life, always reacting to events, always allowing himself to be shaped by circumstances and the opinions of others. He wanted to be the author of his own story. In that moment, with the pain still fresh in his chest, Alex made a choice. He decided he would stop seeing himself as a victim of bullying, pain, and loss. He didn't know where to begin. He didn't have all the answers. But he knew that to change his life, he needed to start with a simple decision. I will no longer let the past define me. The transformation wouldn't be easy. He knew. He would still have to fight the echoes of the cruel words that had scarred him, the fears that had paralyzed him for so long. But for the first time, he felt he had control of his own narrative. Alex began to understand that change wasn't something that would happen magically or immediately. It wasn't about waking up one day and simply leaving the past behind. It was a process, a series of daily choices he would have to make. He needed to learn to trust himself, to value his own qualities, to understand that his self-worth wasn't tied to what others thought of him, but rather to what he thought of himself. He knew that if he truly wanted to change his life, he would need courage. The courage to face his own demons, to face his insecurities and fears head-on. This is how Alex began taking the first steps toward reinvention. He no longer wanted to be an observer of the world, wishing for change without taking action. He wanted to be the protagonist of his own story. So he distanced himself from the people who made him feel small, from those who called him a failure and worthless. He began surrounding himself with people who inspired him, who saw him differently, who saw him as someone with potential, with something to offer the world. Little by little, he began to open himself up to new experiences, allowing himself to do things he previously thought he couldn't. He began to speak more, to express himself more confidently, to place himself at the center of his own life, and no longer as a distant spectator. The greatest change wasn't visible, not in his words or outward actions, but within himself. The true transformation happened within, when he finally decided he would no longer let others define who he was. He began to build a version of himself that didn't depend on the past, the words of others, or the limitations he had imposed on himself. Alex's life would no longer be limited by the cruel words of his childhood, nor by the shadows of loss that still haunted him. He had decided that, while pain was part of his story, it would not be the final chapter. And this decision wasn't easy. There were days when he still found himself doubting himself, when past insecurities returned like ghosts. But instead of giving in to them, he learned to face them. Over time, Alex came to realize something surprising. He didn't have to be perfect. He didn't have to be a everyone pleaser or fit into pre-established molds. What mattered was being true to himself, being authentic, and believing in his worth, regardless of what others thought. He knew the path ahead would be full of obstacles and challenges, but for the first time, Alex felt he was no longer being carried along by the current of life. He had decided to take the helm of his own journey, no longer being carried along by the turbulent waters of bullying and pain. He was ready to lead his own life. Alex's journey was far from easy. He had already made the choice to no longer let the past define him, but now he had to face something far more challenging, his own fears and insecurities. Every step he took toward overcoming them was a constant battle against the inner voice that, for so long, had made him believe he was incapable of anything. He knew that to truly change, he needed not only to overcome the ghosts that haunted him, but also to learn to reconnect with himself in a way he had never done before. Alex came to understand that true healing wasn't simply about walking away from the people or things that hurt him, but about confronting the pain head-on, without fear. The process of self-discovery, which began with a decision to change, was more complex than he imagined. It was as if he were finally unearthing the traumas buried deep within, the ones he had hidden for so long, hoping that time would heal his wounds. But he soon realized that time heals nothing, only masks them. It took courage to look at what was hidden, and with patience, take the first steps toward dealing with it all. There were days when Alex felt small and weak. He felt like his childhood fears were back, ready to swallow him whole again. Sometimes he felt the same discomfort in interactions with others, as if he were back in high school, those days when no one saw him, and all he wanted was to disappear. Insecurity paralyzed him. The feeling that he wasn't good enough made him question his ability to truly change. He still saw himself in internal mirrors, where the reflection was distorted by shame and the cruel words that had scarred him. But something inside Alex began to shift. He began to understand that his fears weren't invincible monsters, but merely shadows created by his own insecurities. He needed to face these fears, name them, and learn to control them, rather than be controlled by them. Instead of running from the pain, Alex began to face it. When he felt insecurity growing within him, he began to ask himself, where does this come from? Why do I still feel this way? It was uncomfortable, but necessary. Over time, he realized that the biggest obstacle he faced wasn't other people's bullying, but the way he still saw himself. He remembered the cruel words that had hurt him so much, but now, instead of letting them consume him, he sought to understand why those words struck him so deeply. He began to realize that it wasn't the words of others that held power, but the power he had given them by believing them for so long. He finally had control. He could decide whether he wanted to continue seeing himself as worthless, or whether he wanted to learn to see himself differently. Alex was no longer alone on this journey. He began seeking support from others who had gone through similar experiences. That's when he met a mentor, someone who had also overcome hardships and was willing to share their own stories and wisdom. With each conversation, Alex gained greater clarity about who he truly was and what he needed to do to free himself from the ghosts of his past. The mentor challenged him, pushing him outside his comfort zone, but with kindness and understanding. Gradually, Alex learned to trust his own abilities, to recognize that, although he had been hurt, he was not defined by those wounds. The biggest challenge, however, was learning to forgive himself. Alex carried a silent guilt, as if he were responsible for the pain he felt over the years, as if he had somehow attracted bullying, shame, and pain. But he began to realize that forgiveness wasn't for others. Forgiveness was, first and foremost, for himself. Forgiving himself for believing the lies he was told, for playing the victim and allowing himself to be swallowed by shame. Forgiveness, finally, began to transform into an act of liberation. He understood that by forgiving himself, he could leave the past behind once and for all. Alex's overcoming wasn't a linear process. Each day was a new battle, a new step out of the shadows. But he was learning to deal with the ups and downs. He understood that he didn't need to be perfect, that the path to self-discovery was, in fact, about being true to himself, accepting himself, even with all his flaws and insecurities. Little by little, he began to see himself differently. He saw himself with more compassion, with more kindness. He no longer saw himself as that boy marked by the words of others, but as someone constantly evolving, someone who, despite the pain, had the power to create a new story for himself. And as he overcame his fears and rediscovered himself, Alex realized something incredible. He didn't need to wait for anyone's validation. He was already enough. He was already worthy of love, respect, and trust. The reflection in the mirror began to change, and more importantly, the way he saw himself began to change. He was no longer the victim. He was the hero of his own story. If you feel that the journey of self-discovery and overcoming obstacles can help you transform your life, like this video and share it with anyone. You know who might also need support and strength to take the next step. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any chapter of this story of overcoming obstacles and transformation. Believe me, you too have the power to change. Alex's transformation didn't happen all at once. He was finally beginning to see himself as a person of value, someone who could have a voice in the world. But there was a part of him that still hesitated. Even with his progress, he felt a constant fear of failure, of being rejected again, of not being able to lead or inspire others. But what he didn't know was that, by overcoming his own insecurities, he was already becoming the kind of person others would begin to look at and say, "I want to be like him." It was during a moment of great pressure that Alex's true awakening occurred. During a leadership project at school, Alex was asked to lead a team that happened to be full of troubled students, those who were always on the sidelines, lacking motivation, and deeply discouraged. The proposal seemed simple, but Alex knew it wasn't just a matter of completing a task. It was an opportunity for something greater, proving to himself and others that he was no longer that invisible kid, but someone capable of inspiring and, more importantly, leading. At first, the team seemed disorganized and disconnected. People were disinterested, cynical, and even laughed at Alex, as if they expected him to fail. Remember, Alex didn't have a success story to back him up. He was a former victim of bullying, someone who had never been seen as a leader. but he was determined. He knew that to achieve something great, he would need to step up, not just in the task at hand, but as someone who could rally people around him, show them a vision, and get them to believe in it. Alex, without realizing it, began doing something he'd never done before: listening. He began talking to team members, understanding their struggles, listening to their stories and concerns. Active listening, something he'd never known how to do, was his first major victory. He began to realize that people didn't just need a leader to order them around or direct them. They needed someone who understood them, someone who made them feel valued and believed in them. That's when he began to see small changes in his team members. People began to open up and collaborate more. Confidence in Alex's words grew, and little by little, what had once seemed an impossible task transformed into something he never imagined possible: a united team with clear goals and a desire to grow together. Alex was, without realizing it, creating an environment of collaboration and respect. He was no longer leading from the top down. He was leading from the inside out. In challenging moments, when things seemed out of control, Alex didn't let himself be discouraged. He didn't just point to solutions. He was vulnerable, sharing his own struggles and mistakes. He knew that leadership isn't about having all the answers, but about having the courage to admit you don't know everything, and at the same time, the confidence to keep trying. Instead of hiding his insecurities, he used his vulnerability as a strength. When he failed, he showed others how to get back up, how to learn from mistakes, how to turn failures into stepping stones to success. This attitude had a devastating effect on the team. They began to see Alex not as the fragile kid who had been mocked, but as someone willing to fight for a greater purpose, someone who truly believed in the power of transformation. Gradually, the team began to shape itself, not just as a group of people working together, but as a united team that supported each other and believed in each other's potential. And in the process, Alex became more than a leader. He became a role model, proof that anyone, no matter how broken, could rise up and achieve something great. Alex was no longer trapped by others' expectations. He had created his own space, where he could be the leader he had always known. Deep down, he could be. True leadership, he realized, wasn't just about giving orders or achieving results, but about touching the lives of those around him, inspiring them to achieve something greater, and empowering them to believe in themselves. He was more than a team leader. He was a leader of hearts and minds. His journey of self-discovery had brought him to this point, and he was now on a path of no return. He had found something more important than acceptance from others. He had found acceptance and respect for himself. It was at that moment that Alex, without realizing it, became the leader he always needed to be. He wasn't forced to lead, but grew naturally amidst challenges. His story, once marked by pain and insecurity, was now a story of inspiration, of someone who, by facing his own fears, was able to awaken leadership within himself and others. Despite Alex's growing success, the path to transformation was far from a straight line. As much as he had taken giant strides toward self-improvement and leadership, obstacles continued to arise, not only from outside, but especially from within. The fear of failure, the self-doubt, and the expectations he placed on himself were more intense than he imagined. What seemed like a positive change in his life would soon turn into a minefield, where every mistake could lead him to question all the progress he had made. Soon after, beginning to assert himself as a leader, Alex faced the harsh reality that not everyone was willing to accept his transformation. There were people, colleagues, and even former friends who still saw Alex as the insecure, invisible boy, the one they believed would never be capable of leading or inspiring. Veiled comments about his position, looks of distrust, and even open criticism of his leadership style began to surface. The shadow of bullying, though now diminished, was still present in unexpected ways, and the insecurity he felt years ago resurfaced from time to time. Are they right? Am I truly capable of leading? What if I fail? What if, in the end, This is all just an illusion I created. These questions hammered at Alex's mind with every criticism he received. Every judgmental look, every negative comment made him doubt himself. He couldn't help it. The words of his former abusers still reverberated in his mind, like ghosts that insisted on returning. The fear of failure was a monster he tried to keep hidden, but in times of pressure, it wouldn't leave him alone. With each step he took on his leadership journey, his doubts intensified. He felt he had to be perfect, that any mistake would be an irreparable failure, not only for himself, but for everyone who believed in him. The responsibility on his shoulders grew with each passing day, and with it, the pressure. He feared that by trying to lead, he was only asking to be knocked down, to show himself vulnerable, and then be rejected again. Self-criticism, which had always been a shadow in his life, now became a barrier he had to face with every decision he made. And as much as he knew he was making a difference, that he was growing as a person and a leader, Alex still had to face the most painful challenges, his own fears and insecurities. He began to question himself. Am I really worthy of being here? Do I deserve to be in this role? Do people really trust me, or are they just tolerating me? These doubts weren't unique to Alex. Many around him, especially those closest to him, began to doubt his leadership as well. They found it strange to see this once shy and shunned boy now taking on a prominent position. The fact that Alex stood out and led a team with such skill and courage generated envy and resistance. Some saw him as a threat, others as someone trying to be something he wasn't. To them, Alex was still nothing more than the boy who had been cast aside in the past. These external obstacles, these criticisms and judgments, constantly tested Alex. But what he didn't know was that these adversities were actually what would strengthen him. Every criticism he received, every suspicious look, served as a reminder that true leadership wasn't about pleasing everyone, but about staying true to one's own journey. He was beginning to understand that no matter how much others doubted him, the most important thing was that he believed in himself. He had to learn, the hard way, that leadership isn't just about achieving success, but about facing obstacles along the way, failures, criticism, and still moving forward. When something went wrong, Alex could no longer hide in shame or fear. He had to learn to deal with mistakes constructively, to understand that failure was just part of the process, an opportunity for growth. Every mistake, every challenge, was a chance to improve. It was then that Alex began to realize that it was okay not to please everyone. True leadership isn't about fitting in or pleasing others, but about being authentic, being true to who you are, and continuing to move forward despite adversity. He was learning to handle pressure and use criticism as fuel to improve even further. And most importantly, he learned that he didn't have to be perfect. He didn't have to carry the burden of being an ideal version of himself. He needed to be the best Alex he could be, without putting too much pressure on himself, without trying to be someone he wasn't. By embracing his imperfections, he found even greater strength to continue his journey. The day came when Alex looked back and saw a journey that, though painful, had been shaped by his courage and determination. He was no longer the shy, insecure boy, scarred by the cruel words of his past. He had overcome the shame, pain, and emotional scars he carried, and in doing so, he became something much greater, a leader. But not just any kind of leader. He was not the arrogant or aloof leader, but someone who had earned the respect of others, not only for his achievements, but for the strength with which he rose, day after day, to face his own demons. What truly defined Alex as a leader, what made him truly admired, was his ability to transform pain into a force for good. He didn't hide his imperfections, but embraced them, using them to help others realize that, even with flaws, everyone has the capacity to grow, rise again, and achieve great things. He began to be respected, not for his perfection, but for his authenticity, his vulnerability, and above all, his ability to inspire others to rise up as well. Alex knew that true leadership isn't about having all the answers, nor about being infallible. It's about showing others that even in adversity, we can find an inner strength capable of transforming our reality. He became a living example that no one is condemned to live under the weight of the past, that anyone, no matter how scarred, has the power to write a new story. Alex had reinvented himself, and now he was helping others do the same. He was no longer seen as an easy target for bullying, the boy who hid behind the shadows of fear and insecurity. He was seen as a symbol of resilience, courage, and resilience. Every time he spoke, people didn't just hear his words, they saw the power behind them, the strength of someone who rose from the depths of despair, and in doing so, became someone capable of guiding others to do the same. Now, looking back on his journey, Alex no longer felt the weight of shame. He felt the lightness of someone who had finally found himself. It wasn't titles or recognition he sought, but the deep satisfaction of knowing that, by overcoming himself, he had become someone who could truly make a difference in the lives of those around him. He knew that his true victory lay not in external achievements, but in his ability to transform his own pain into a source of power for others. And it is in this moment of realization that true leadership reveals itself. It's not about climbing the ladder of success, but about reaching out to lift others who are fallen beside you. Alex became a leader because he understood that his greatest power lay in helping those who, like him, had been touched by pain and insecurity. He was no longer a victim, no longer an observer of life. He was the protagonist of his own story, and in doing so, he was changing the stories of others as well. If you believe you too can reinvent yourself, rise up, and overcome life's challenges, like this video, and share it with those who need to hear this message. True leadership begins within us, and you have the power to transform it into something great. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to see more stories of overcoming and transformation. Together, we can inspire each other to reach new horizons. Change starts now, and it starts with you.